From Beijing, a story is unfolding that links pipelines, power grids and politics into a single thread of global consequence. On September 2nd, Russian President Vladimir Putin sat down with Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico in the Chinese capital. The meeting was cordial in appearance, but its message was anything but routine. Putin used the opportunity to send one of his sharpest signals yet about Ukraine, Europe, and the shifting balance of world power. The handshake at the start looked ordinary enough, cameras capturing the Russian leader welcoming the Slovak delegation. But behind closed doors, the discussion quickly turned to energy, the lifeline of both Ukraine's resistance and Europe's stability. Putin's words were blunt. He urged Bratislava to shut down Ukraine's access to reverse-flow gas and electricity. In his telling, it was time for Kyiv to learn that there were limits to what Moscow would tolerate. For years, Ukraine has relied on its neighbours to move gas back across borders, bypassing Russia's cut-offs. Slovakia is one of those key conduits, and Putin's suggestion was clear: close the valve, switch off the grid, and squeeze Ukraine until it bows. Shut off their gas supplies that go in reverse, he declared. Shut off electricity supplies. They will immediately understand there are some limits to their behaviour. The statement, carried live and later released by the Kremlin, was a reminder that energy remains one of Russia's most potent weapons. Putin justified this call for escalation by pointing to Ukraine's strikes on Russian infrastructure. He claimed that Moscow had shown patience for too long, tolerating attacks on its power plants and energy hubs. Now, he argued, Russia had responded forcefully, and Ukraine, in turn, was harming not only Russia, but also its partners in Europe. It was a narrative carefully crafted to shift blame away from Moscow and onto Kyiv, painting Russia as the aggrieved party and justifying further pressure on Ukraine's allies. But the Beijing meeting was not only about energy. Putin also offered a glimpse into his latest diplomatic calculations. He pointed to recent talks with US President Donald Trump in Anchorage, Alaska. There, he said, the new administration listens to us. The contrast with the Biden years was unmistakable. Under Biden, he claimed, no one wanted to hear Russia's concerns. Under Trump, however, Moscow sees what Putin described as mutual understanding. For Russia, this shift matters. For months, the Kremlin has argued that Western leadership refuses to acknowledge its red lines. Now, with a different tone in Washington, Putin sees an opening. His words suggested a Kremlin eager to exploit divisions between European capitals and the United States and between Kyiv and its supporters. Yet the Russian president also reiterated the limits of that openness. On Ukraine's future in the European Union, he said Moscow had never objected. But when it comes to NATO, the line was firm. Membership in the alliance, Putin declared, was unacceptable, not just for today, not just in the medium term, but for generations to come. For Russia, this is not a tactical disagreement, but a strategic red line etched into its security doctrine. And still, there was a hint of compromise in his remarks. Putin acknowledged that options exist for guaranteeing Ukraine's security once the conflict ends. These options, he noted, had been part of his discussions with Trump in Anchorage. It seems to me there is an opportunity to find consensus, he said. The phrasing was cautious, but it suggested that Moscow might consider alternatives to NATO membership, arrangements that could satisfy both Russia's insistence on buffer zones and Ukraine's demand for protection. Taken together, the meeting in Beijing revealed a three-layered strategy. First, pressure Europe through energy, testing the loyalty of countries like Slovakia. Second, exploit US political shifts to create openings that were unavailable just a year ago. And third, dangle the possibility of compromise, framing Russia not as an aggressor, but as a pragmatic actor open to dialogue. The implications are vast. If Slovakia complies with Putin's demand, Ukraine would face a severe blow to its energy supply just as winter approaches. Kyiv's ability to heat homes, power factories, and sustain its war effort would be compromised. But Bratislava, too, would face risks, alienating European partners, inviting sanctions, and deepening its reliance on Moscow. For Prime Minister Robert Fico, a populist leader who has often voiced sympathy for Russia, the decision is a political tightrope. For the European Union, the moment is a test of unity. Brussels has long urged its members to resist Russian pressure and maintain solidarity with Ukraine. If Slovakia bends, others might follow, fracturing the common front. If it resists, Moscow could retaliate through cyber attacks, trade disruptions, or covert operations. Either way, the pressure on Europe will rise. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Kremlin is watching carefully. Putin's comments about Anchorage were more than a diplomatic aside. They were a deliberate message. By praising Trump for listening, the Kremlin underscored its belief that US foreign policy is in flux. That flux could reshape the war, either by loosening Western resolve or by creating new negotiating channels that bypass Europe altogether. All of this took place in China, a location not chosen at random. By holding the meeting in Beijing, Putin underscored Russia's pivot to Asia, aligning with powers like China to signal that Moscow is not isolated. The backdrop of Chinese hospitality offered legitimacy and strength, reinforcing the image of Russia as a player with global partners, not a pariah. But beyond the optics lies a harsher truth. Europe's energy security remains a hostage to geopolitics. Pipelines crossing borders are no longer just conduits of fuel, they are tools of war. Electricity grids are no longer neutral infrastructure, they are bargaining chips in a conflict that shows no sign of resolution. And diplomacy itself is no longer just about treaties and communiques, it is about survival, leverage, and the willingness to endure pain. As the world watches, the Beijing meeting marks another escalation in the war's diplomatic theatre. Putin has drawn his lines clearly. Ukraine must remain outside NATO, the United States must acknowledge Russia's concerns, and Europe must decide how much it is willing to sacrifice to resist Moscow's pressure. For Ukraine, the struggle is existential. For Europe, it is a test of unity. For the United States, it is a question of leadership. And for Russia, it is a strategy built on energy, alliances, and the long shadow of history. 12 minutes may be only a moment in the arc of a war that has stretched over 2.5 years. But in diplomacy, a moment can shift the balance. In Beijing, that moment was captured as Vladimir Putin and Robert Fico exchanged words that could shape not only the next winter in Ukraine, but the next decade of European security. This is not just a meeting between two leaders, it is a signal to the world. The war in Ukraine is not confined to the trenches or the skies. It is being fought in gas pipelines, electrical grids, and negotiation halls thousands of miles away. And in that war, every word, every handshake, every call for action matters.
Уважаемые все мои эмоции связаны с победой в ЕС и член НАТО. Вы можете себе позволить критиковать.
Fungujeme s americkou spoločnosťou Westinghouse. Vy dobre viete, že...
Это уже хорошо. Приятный вопрос.
Nejaké si prejavili počas oslav 80. výročia konca druhej svetovej vojny.
Закройте поставки газа, которые по реверсу. Закройте поставки электроэнергии, и они сразу поймут, что есть какие-то пределы их поведения в области нарушения чужих интересов. Мы очень долго терпели, когда украинские войска наносили постоянные удары по нашим энергетическим объектам. После этого начали отвечать. И мы отвечаем, конечно, так скажем, серьезно. Это правда. В ответ украинская сторона пытается нанести ущерб нам, но наносит ущерб и нашим партнерам. Ну что можно? И наши последние контакты с президентом Трампом, с американской администрацией в Анкоридже показали, что нас слышит новая администрация. Потому что если мы раньше контакта с прежней администрацией, с президентом Байденом, говорили об этом, нас никто не хотел в уши и не слышал никто. Сейчас мы видим такое понимание взаимное. Замечательно. Мы очень рады и надеемся, что этот конструктивный диалог будет продолжен. Ну а что касается членства Украины в ЕС, мы никогда против этого не возражаем. Вот, что касается НАТО, это другой вопрос. Но здесь речь идет об обеспечении безопасности Российской Федерации. Причем не только сегодня, не среднесрочной, а в долгосрочной перспективе. Наша позиция здесь известна, мы считаем это для себя неприемлемым. Естественно. Здесь есть варианты обеспечения безопасности Украины в случае завершения конфликта. Это тоже было предметом нашего обсуждения в Анкоридже, и мне кажется, здесь есть возможность